In the winter of 1834, a bitter chill gripped the Scottish Highlands. Villages huddled beneath layers of mist, their cottages crouched low against the wind, smoke curling upward like fragile prayers. The land was hard, but the faith of its people was harder still, shaped by centuries of sermons that promised salvation through fire and brimstone. Fear of God was not just a belief. It was law binding every soul in obedience, and it was here in a small stone kirk standing lonely against the moors that fear would be twisted into something darker, something monstrous. The preacher who ruled this flock was no gentle shepherd. His sermons thundered with threats of damnation, his eyes burned with fevered conviction. To him, sin was everywhere, woven into laughter, hidden in silence, pulsing even in the hearts of children. His congregation listened, trembling, convinced that only through his voice could they find the narrow path to heaven. But what happens when a shepherd decides his flock is unworthy of the meadow, unworthy of breath itself? What happens when faith becomes fire? That winter, the kirk became more than a house of prayer. It became a tomb. On a night when wind screamed across the stones and the hills seemed to hold their breath, the preacher called his people together. They came willingly, clutching lanterns, carrying children in shawls, their faith stronger than their fear. He preached of purification, of wickedness that had wormed into every home, of flames that alone could cleanse. They nodded, hearts pounding, believing his words were not his own but God's command. And then he barred the doors. The people inside understood too late that the shepherd they had trusted had become their executioner. Outside, neighbors watched as the kirk's windows glowed red, as smoke clawed upward into the night sky. Some swore they heard hymns twisted into screams, prayers turned into pleas for mercy that never came. The fire raged until dawn, and when it finally fell silent, there was nothing left but ash, bone, and a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the village itself. The world would remember it as one of the most brutal betrayals of faith in Scotland's history. A man meant to guide souls had instead condemned them, binding belief to horror, turning devotion into death. And yet, long after the smoke cleared, questions lingered like shadows across the moors. Was he mad? Was he possessed by something darker than madness? Or was he simply a man who believed too much? The kirk's ruins still stand, blackened stones reaching toward a gray sky, a scar that time could not erase. Travelers claim the air there tastes of soot, that the silence carries a weight heavier than stone. And on winter nights, when fog coils low and the wind moans across the heath, some swear the sound of hymns rises again, soft at first, then swelling, until the echo of screams drowns out the song. The roots of this tragedy stretch deep into the stony soil of Scotland's early 19th century, a time when faith was both shield and sword. The year was 1834, and the Highlands were still scarred by hunger, feuds, and the memory of clans broken under the crown's hand. Poverty lingered in every thatched home, and with it came a hunger for meaning, for salvation. The kirk, that small stone church on the edge of the village, was not just a place of worship. It was the heart of life itself, the anchor that held together the weary and the poor. To be outside of the kirk was to be outside of community, outside of safety, outside of God. This power gave preachers immense sway over the lives of their flock, and few wielded it with as much fervor, or as much fear, as Reverend Malcolm Fletcher. Fletcher was not born to the pulpit but to hardship. His father had been a shepherd on the moors, his mother a weaver who died young from fever. Raised in shadows of grief, Malcolm clung early to Scripture as his only certainty. At divinity school in Edinburgh, he stood out not for brilliance but for zeal. Fellow students described him as a man whose prayers bordered on rants, whose eyes shone with the kind of fire that unsettled even the devout. He returned to the Highlands ordained, carrying not gentleness but severity, preaching not comfort but terror. The wages of sin is death, he thundered week after week, his voice carrying through the thin walls of cottages like the toll of a funeral bell. The village he served was small, perhaps 100 souls scattered along the valley road. They were farmers and shepherds, their days defined by toil and weather, their nights by prayer. Fletcher saw in them not people to guide but sinners to purge. Women were chastised for laughter, men condemned for drink, children rebuked for play. Every act was measured against his rigid view of purity, and by his measure none were pure. He believed corruption lay in every smile, every comfort, every silence. His sermons painted the world in black and white, heaven or hell, salvation or damnation, with no room for the gray shades of human weakness. At first, the villagers accepted his harshness. Harshness was familiar. Life itself was harsh. They listened with bowed heads, convinced that Fletcher's voice echoed the will of God. Fear kept them in the pews, fear of his condemnation, fear of eternal fire. But slowly his sermons began to darken further. He spoke less of grace, more of wrath. He thundered of the rotting flock, of souls gnawed by unseen worms. He claimed to see demons dancing in the moors, shadows lurking behind every cottage door. And he began to speak of fire, not as metaphor but as necessity. Fire cleanses, he repeated week after week until it became refrain, until even the children whispered it in their games. Rumors whispered beyond the kirk's walls. Some said Fletcher had stopped eating with others, that he fasted until his cheeks hollowed and his eyes gleamed with a fevered light. Others said he walked the graveyard at night, muttering prayers until dawn. His housekeeper claimed she found scorched pages of scripture in his hearth, verses blackened by flame as though he sought revelation in their burning. More troubling still, he began writing letters to other ministers, warning that the devil had claimed not only the world, but the kirk itself. Few responded. Those who did urged caution, prayer, and rest. He read their words as cowardice. In his mind, he was the lone watchman on the wall and all others were blind. The village began to feel his madness tightening like a noose. Weddings grew somber under his gaze, funerals more terrifying than consoling. He declared that unbaptized infants could not be buried in consecrated ground, and forced grieving mothers to lay their babies in cold earth beyond the churchyard walls. He banned dances, silenced songs, even rebuked the playing of fiddles, claiming the devil lurked in their strings. The kirk, once a place of solace, became a place of dread, its heavy doors opening not to comfort but to judgment. Yet still the people came, drawn by fear, by tradition, by the belief that to turn away was to invite damnation. It was during this time that Fletcher began speaking of visions. He told of dreams in which flames devoured the moors, sparing only those who embraced the fire as God's will. He told of voices in the wind, whispering that the flock had grown too tainted to be saved. He warned that the end was near, that God would demand sacrifice, that purification was the only path left. Most villagers shuddered but obeyed. A few tried to resist, to question, but his wrath was swift. Those who dared miss service found him at their doors, his eyes blazing, his words cutting sharper than any blade. His hold grew tighter, his sermons darker, his obsession with fire deeper. The kirk itself mirrored its master's descent. Once whitewashed, its walls grew soot-stained from the endless candles he burned during his vigils. Windows rattled from the force of his sermons, and the pulpit seemed less a place of teaching than a stage for condemnation. The very air inside seemed heavier, thick with the weight of fear and the smell of smoke. Children whispered that shadows lingered longer within its walls, that footsteps echoed when no one walked. Their parents hushed them, but they too felt the unease. It was as if the kirk itself was waiting, holding its breath as Fletcher prepared to turn his visions into flesh. By the autumn of 1834, his obsession could no longer be contained within words. His sermons became wild, disjointed, filled with rants about the final fire. Witnesses described him foaming at the mouth, his fists striking the pulpit until blood stained the wood. He warned that the congregation's sins had reached heaven's ears and that only one act could cleanse them all. Few understood the depth of his intent, but many felt the shiver of doom crawl up their spines. They feared him, yes, but they feared hell more. And in that fear lay their undoing. They continued to gather, to listen, to obey, unaware that obedience would soon become their sentence. For Malcolm Fletcher had convinced himself of a terrible truth, that to save his flock he must destroy it. By the first weeks of December 1834, the valley seemed to carry an unnatural heaviness, as if the moors themselves bent beneath a weight that had no name. Villagers moved through their days with a quiet dread, glancing toward the kirk on the hill where Reverend Malcolm Fletcher's voice rose like thunder against the winter sky. His sermons had grown longer, harsher, and more chaotic, spilling beyond scripture into visions of torment. Congregants sat stiff in their pews, clutching worn Bibles, trembling as his words painted the world as a furnace waiting to be lit. He no longer spoke of mercy, only of fire. "The flames will cleanse you," he would roar, his face slick with sweat even in the bitter cold, "and through fire alone will your souls be made whole." Mothers pressed hands over their children's ears, but still the words soaked in, carried home, repeated in whispers around hearths where fires no longer seemed to bring warmth but threat. At first, many tried to dismiss his darkening sermons as zeal unchecked. The villagers had long endured strict preachers, men who thundered of sin and threatened hell. Yet Fletcher's obsession pressed beyond tradition. He fasted until his frame grew gaunt, his eyes sunken yet burning. He wandered the moors at night, his cloak flapping like a raven's wings, muttering prayers that twisted into shrieks. Some said he carried torches into the heather, setting small fires that burned in the fog before vanishing without a trace. Others swore they saw him kneeling among the gravestones, striking flint again and again until sparks danced like devils over the frost. Rumors spread quickly, but so did fear. To speak against him was to risk his wrath and worse, to risk eternal condemnation as he so often promised. The kirk itself grew stranger, darker. Parishioners noted the lingering smell of smoke long after services ended, though no hearth had burned inside. Fletcher's vigils stretched until dawn, candles consuming themselves to stubs that littered the pulpit in waxen drips like melted bones. Children whispered of shadows moving when no one walked, of hymns sung in empty pews, of the preacher's voice carrying even when the church lay locked and still. Parents hushed them, but even the adults admitted to hearing strange echoes when passing the hill at night. Echoes that were not quite words, not quite song. The kirk became less a place of gathering than of dread, yet still they came, bound by duty, by habit, by fear of his judgment. For to turn away was to be cast as lost sheep, and none dared risk the flames he promised to those outside the fold. As weeks passed, Fletcher's grip deepened. He began visiting homes uninvited, appearing in doorways with wild eyes, demanding to inspect for sin. He overturned cupboards in search of liquor, scolded women for laughter, berated fathers for idle talk. He warned that the devil sat at every hearth and that only constant prayer could keep him at bay. He spoke of dreams in which fire consumed the valley, sparing none but those who embraced it willingly. Some began to avoid him, locking doors, dimming lanterns when his shadow passed. Yet even in their fear, many still clung to him, believing that perhaps his severity was proof of holiness. Better to follow a mad shepherd, they thought, than risk the wolves of hell alone. Whispers rose among the village elders, cautious debates behind closed shutters. Some suggested appealing to church authorities in Edinburgh. Others urged patience, hoping Fletcher's madness would burn itself out. But distance and winter's grip made outside help impossible, and indecision grew as strong as fear. No one wanted to be the first to speak aloud what many feared, that their preacher had lost his soul. And so they waited, hesitated, prayed for deliverance. Each delay drew them deeper into his snare. The tension thickened when Fletcher began gathering strange supplies. Villagers noticed barrels of pitch and oil delivered to the kirk under cover of night. He claimed they were for repairs, to seal leaks against the winter rain, yet no repairs were ever made. Some saw him carrying bundles of kindling into the vestry, stacking them with care, whispering as he worked. His housekeeper fled in terror after finding him in the sanctuary at midnight, standing before the altar with both hands scorched, smiling as though pain itself was revelation. She told others, he had whispered, "Soon they will burn clean," and refused ever to return. Instead of igniting outrage, her story deepened the villagers' dread, for they feared to confront him, feared even more what he might do if challenged. By Christmas, the village lay split between suspicion and paralysis. Families debated in hushed tones. Was Fletcher God's chosen prophet demanding sacrifice in a sinful age? Or had he surrendered himself to madness, perhaps even to darker powers? Some mothers begged their husbands to keep the children from service, but the men insisted attendance was safer than absence. To miss church was to draw Fletcher's fury, and his fury had grown dangerous. The kirk bells rang, and the people climbed the hill, driven by fear more than faith. Each tolling seemed less a call to worship than a summons to judgment. Strange signs appeared in the weeks that followed. Livestock refused to graze near the kirk, bleating in panic at the sound of its bells. Smoke curled from its chimney at hours when no fire should burn. One shepherd swore he saw figures moving inside long after midnight, though every door was bolted. And then there were the dreams. Families across the valley spoke of waking in terror, claiming they had dreamed of fire consuming the kirk, of children screaming, of hymns distorted into cries for mercy. At first they dismissed it as shared fear, but as the dreams multiplied, as neighbors confessed the same visions, unease spread like frost across the moor. Fletcher, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger as the flock weakened. His voice carried with a new violence, his fists striking the pulpit until splinters flew. He began calling his congregation the tainted, accusing them of harboring sin so deep that prayer alone could no longer cleanse them. He told them the hour was near, that God's fire would soon descend, and that only those who embraced it willingly could hope for salvation. The people sat frozen, their hearts thudding, unable to rise, unable to resist. Fear bound them tighter than chains. The final weeks of tension felt like the drawing of a bowstring, pulled tighter and tighter, waiting for release. Each sermon stretched longer, each denunciation harsher, each warning more dire. The kirk groaned beneath the weight of his fury, its rafters echoing with his shouts, its walls darkened with soot. The villagers walked home shaken, yet returned again and again as if hypnotized, as if unable to break free. Children clung to their mothers, sensing doom their elders dared not name, and still Fletcher whispered of fire, promised it as gift, as punishment, as destiny. The moors seemed to wait, the fog to thicken, the silence between bells to deepen. Something terrible was coming, and the valley knew it. They just did not yet know how close it was. On the night of January 18, 1835, the air over the valley was still and heavy, the kind of silence that presses on the chest, that makes even the strong uneasy. The kirk bell rang long after sundown, its tolling low and uneven as though struck by a trembling hand. Families stirred from their hearths, glancing at one another with dread. Fletcher had summoned them at an hour no sermon should be given. Yet to resist was unthinkable, so one by one doors opened, lanterns lit, and the people climbed the hill toward the looming kirk. The mist swallowed their footsteps, carrying them upward like souls into judgment. Some whispered prayers. Others gripped children's hands so tightly their knuckles whitened. All felt the pull of fear greater than reason. They entered the kirk and found Fletcher already waiting at the pulpit. His face was pale, almost luminescent in the candlelight, his eyes hollow but aflame. The sanctuary was thick with the smell of oil and pitch. Candles burned in every corner, their flames small but countless, reflecting like stars off dark stains that streaked the wooden beams. Bundles of kindling lay stacked along the walls, hidden in shadow, but visible now that fear sharpened every sense. The people hesitated, realizing at last that this was no ordinary service. Fletcher raised both arms and cried, "The hour has come. The Lord's cleansing fire is upon us." His voice boomed, echoing like thunder through the rafters. The doors were bolted shut behind them, the sound of iron sliding home echoing like a sentence passed. Panic rippled through the congregation, but Fletcher's presence rooted them in place. He began to preach louder than ever before, his words fevered, spilling over into shouts and sobs. He condemned them for their sins, drunkenness, pride, lust, disobedience. He called their souls filthy, unworthy of grace except through flames. Children wept, women clutched their skirts, men stared in disbelief. Still they did not rise. Still they did not resist. Fletcher moved from the pulpit, descending the aisle carrying a torch. Its fire flickered across their faces, casting them in orange and shadow. He brushed it along the pews as he passed, leaving trails of smoke, the scent of pitch rising stronger. "Do not fear," he cried, his voice breaking, "for through this fire you shall be made pure." A few men leapt up, demanding he stop, but Fletcher's gaze burned into them with such intensity that their courage faltered. He struck the floorboards with the torch, sparks spitting, the wood groaning as if alive. The people screamed, rising now in panic, rushing to the doors only to find them sealed tight with chains. Fletcher had prepared everything. His trap was perfect. The women beat against the doors, the men hurled their shoulders against the wood, but the iron held. Smoke thickened, choking, the flames catching faster than any had thought possible. Fletcher's madness had been meticulous. The beams soaked in oil, the walls lined with kindling, every surface prepared to burn. The kirk became a furnace in moments. Fletcher stood in the center, torch raised high, his face alight with ecstasy. He shouted scripture twisted into doom, fragments of psalms, cries from Revelation. "The fire of the Lord shall consume you as chaff before the wind." His voice rose above the screams, above the crackle of fire carrying into the night as though he preached not to men but to eternity. The people scattered within, pressing against windows too narrow, choking in the smoke. A boy was lifted toward a high slit of glass, but the stone frame cut him as he struggled, his cries lost in the roar. Others tried to climb the rafters, hoping for escape, but the beams cracked and fell, crushing those beneath. The pews became coffins, the aisle a pyre. Still Fletcher raved, laughing and sobbing, his torch now discarded as the flames consumed his sanctuary. Some swore he walked untouched through fire, his robes glowing, his hands raised as though in worship. Others claimed he knelt upon the altar, letting the flames engulf him with a smile upon his lips. The truth vanished in smoke. By the time villagers from the far side of the valley arrived, drawn by the glow against the night sky, the kirk was a pillar of fire, its spire collapsing in a shower of sparks that rained down like judgment. They heard the screams even from the moor, piercing, terrible, until one by one they fell silent, leaving only the roar of burning wood. The rescuers tried to force the doors, but heat drove them back. The iron warped, the timbers falling inward. The church became a tomb, its flames consuming voices, bodies, memories. When dawn came, nothing remained but blackened stones and smoldering ash. The smell of charred flesh hung in the air, coating every breath with horror. Silence lay heavy, broken only by the crack of collapsing beams, the hiss of dying fire. Among the ruin they found no survivors. The preacher and his flock alike had perished. Yet witnesses swore the last voice they heard before the roof gave way was not of terror but of exultation. The preacher crying out as though triumphant, as though he had delivered them to his God. Some villagers collapsed in grief, others in rage, but all carried scars that would never fade. The kirk on the hill was gone, replaced by a ruin that smoldered for days, a wound upon the land itself. And though Fletcher's body was never identified among the ash, many swore his shadow lingered in the smoke that drifted over the valley, watching, waiting, as if his fire had not yet burned its fill. When the last flames died, the valley was left with silence deeper than mourning. Smoke clung to the moors for days, a bitter fog that seeped into cottages and fields, carrying with it the stench of burnt flesh. The kirk, once a place of worship, was reduced to a hollow of scorched stone, its roof gone, its pews reduced to ash. The great bell, which had summoned the faithful for generations, lay cracked and blackened in the rubble, as if silenced by the very heavens it once praised. The villagers gathered at dawn, their faces pale, their clothes soaked with soot and tears. They searched the ruins with trembling hands, but what they found broke even the hardest hearts. Charred bones scattered across the floor where families once sat together, fragments of melted iron from lanterns and chains, small shoes fused to wood. The smell was unbearable, forcing some to retch into the ash while others knelt in prayer, their words torn between anger at God and despair for the dead. Mothers screamed when they recognized bits of fabric. Fathers collapsed when they uncovered the skeletal arms of children still entwined together. Gravediggers worked without pause, but there were no bodies to bury, only fragments. They dug a common grave on the hill below the kirk, a pit deep enough to hold the remains of 68 souls. Villagers lined the edges, weeping as they lowered the ash and bone into the earth. There were no coffins, no markers of names, only a mound of soil to cover what could not be separated. One priest from a neighboring parish tried to speak words of blessing, but his voice broke and silence replaced ritual. Some swore they saw smoke still rising from the soil, as though the grave itself smoldered. Fear spread like a contagion. Parents kept their children indoors. Doors were bolted at night, prayers whispered in secret. No one dared step foot near the ruins after sundown. The kirk's blackened walls stood like teeth against the sky, jagged and accusing, visible from every corner of the valley. Travelers began avoiding the road entirely, circling miles out of their way to escape its sight. Whispers spread quickly across Scotland. News traveled to nearby towns, then to cities until the tale reached Edinburgh itself. Rumors twisted the facts with every retelling. Some said Fletcher had been a prophet, chosen to cleanse sinners through flame. Others claimed he had gone mad, poisoned by isolation and fevered faith. Still others whispered that he had been touched by something unholy, that the devil had worn a preacher's robes. The church authorities dispatched men to investigate, but when they arrived they recoiled from the ruin. Even hardened bishops refused to enter the scorched remains, claiming the air itself felt cursed. They declared the site forsaken ground, unfit for prayer or consecration. Instead of rebuilding, they ordered it left as ruin, a warning carved into stone and silence. Villagers did not argue. They wanted no more sermons, no more fire, no more chains of faith that bound them to death. Yet the scars remained. Survivors, those who had not attended that night, who had escaped only by chance, lived with guilt heavier than mourning. One woman, spared only because she had been ill in bed, walked the moors daily, crying out her children's names into the mist. A farmer who had overslept the summons threw himself into the river weeks later, unable to bear the weight of survival. Whole families vanished, leaving cottages empty, their hearths cold because there was no one left to tend them. The valley shrank into a husk of itself, its people broken, its future stolen. In nearby villages, strangers treated survivors as cursed, avoiding their touch, refusing to trade with them. They were marked by fire, tainted by what had happened, as though Fletcher's madness had seeped into their blood. They carried this shame like a brand, whispered about in marketplaces, pointed at on roads. And yet even those who mocked them feared the tale. No one could understand how a man of God had become an executioner, how faith had been twisted into fire. That lack of reason gnawed at them, spreading unease far beyond the valley. In the weeks after, strange stories emerged. Travelers swore they saw smoke rising from the ruin long after the flames had died, thick and black though no wood remained. Shepherds heard voices on the wind, low chanting that rose and fell with the fog. Children spoke of figures moving among the stones at night, shadows that did not belong to living men. Some villagers believed Fletcher still walked among the ruins, his soul bound to the site, condemned to preach to ashes until judgment. Others said the voices were not his, but those of the congregation, trapped in eternal prayer, calling out for release that never came. Whatever the truth, no one dared linger near the kirk. Its silence was unbearable, its presence a constant reminder of betrayal. And in every hearth across the highlands, people told their children the same warning: beware the shepherd who demands too much, for his fire may not be holy. The event etched itself into Scotland's dark history, not just as a tragedy but as a curse. Those who lived through it never forgot the glow of the fire on the hill, the screams carried on the wind, the silence that followed. And for generations after, the valley was known not by its crops or its people, but by its ruin, by the preacher who turned faith into ash. Long after the ash had settled and the valley's soil swallowed the remains of the dead, questions lingered like smoke that refused to clear. No one could agree on what had truly driven Reverend Fletcher to such madness. Some clung to the explanation of illness, whispering that he had been struck by fever or poisoned by bad grain. They pointed to his gaunt frame, his trembling hands, the wild light in his eyes during his final sermons. Madness, they said. A sickness of the mind. Yet others rejected this. Madness could make a man ramble, but could it lead him to build a plan so deliberate? To soak beams in oil? To stack kindling so carefully, to chain doors shut with precision? That was no fever. That was preparation, meticulous and chilling. If it was not sickness, then what? Some villagers swore Fletcher had been touched by the devil himself. They recalled how his sermons had shifted from scripture to fire, how his words seemed to rise from him like smoke, heavy and unnatural. They claimed his voice had deepened, carrying notes that did not belong to mortal throats. One woman, who had sat in the front pew weeks before the fire, testified that when Fletcher looked at her, she saw not his eyes, but flames flickering in their depths. To her dying day, she believed she had looked into hell. Church officials tried to dismiss these accounts, yet even they hesitated to step inside the ruins. One bishop who dared cross the threshold of the scorched kirk emerged, trembling, muttering that the stones themselves whispered. He never spoke publicly of what he heard, but within months he resigned his office and vanished from record. Then there were the sounds. Shepherds grazing flocks near the hill began reporting hymns rising at dusk, faint at first, then swelling into choruses that froze their blood. When they approached, the singing stopped, replaced by silence so oppressive it made the air heavy in their lungs. Travelers who camped nearby awoke to cries carried on the wind, pleas for mercy, the wails of children. Some said the smoke returned on certain nights, not white but black and oily, curling from the ruins, though nothing remained to burn. Others swore they saw figures moving in the glow, silhouettes of families clutching each other, their mouths open in endless screams. The most chilling reports came from those who claimed to see Fletcher himself. Tall, robed in shadow, his face hidden but his outline unmistakable, standing in the doorway of the ruin as if still summoning his flock. One farmer swore he locked eyes with the figure from across the moor. When he turned to run, the sound of the cracked bell rang out behind him, though no bell remained. He refused to return to the valley again. Skeptics tried to explain it all as grief and guilt. Survivors needed ghosts, they said, to carry the weight of what they had lived through. But explanations crumbled in the face of so many accounts, so many voices repeating the same horrors. Could 100 grieving people all imagine the same hymns, the same bell, the same preacher's shadow? Even science faltered. In 1841, nearly 7 years after the fire, scholars from Edinburgh traveled to study the site. They tested the stones, scraped ash from the soil, measured the ruined walls. At night they set camp by the kirk. 2 of them never returned. Their companions reported that the men rose at midnight, their faces blank, and walked silently into the ruins. Moments later the sound of singing erupted, loud enough to rattle the ground. By the time torches were lit, the men were gone. Their belongings remained, but no trace of them was ever found. The incident was buried in church records, hushed away as blasphemy, but whispers spread. The ruin was no longer simply haunted. It was a maw that swallowed souls. For decades afterward, villagers marked the anniversary of the fire by shuttering windows and refusing to leave their homes. On that night, they said, the kirk came alive again. Flames flickered in the windows. Voices rose in hymn and scream alike, and the moor glowed red as if the fire had never died. Children were told to stay in bed to block their ears, for if they listened too closely, the voices would call them by name. Those foolish enough to visit after sundown returned changed, their eyes hollow, their speech broken, some refusing to ever speak of what they saw. The most terrifying part was not what they described, but what they refused to. Silence became the loudest evidence of all. In time, the kirk was abandoned entirely, left to ruin and storm. The moor claimed its walls, ivy clung to its stones, but the scar never healed. Even now, travelers speak of the place in hushed tones. Some call it cursed ground, others a monument to human cruelty. Yet all agree on one thing. The mystery of that night was never solved. Was Fletcher a madman, a prophet, or something far worse? Did his fire consume only bodies, or did it open a door that could never be closed? The valley still waits for an answer. And on winter nights, when mist coils over the heather and the wind moans through the ruins, some say the kirk still speaks, its stones breathing with voices that are not of this world. They do not tell you to enter. They tell you to run. The ruin of the kirk stands to this day, its blackened stones rising like broken teeth against the sky. A reminder of the night faith became fire. Generations have come and gone, yet the scar refuses to fade. Farmers plow around the hill, but never upon it. Shepherds steer their flocks wide, as if animals too can sense the weight of damnation. Travelers pause at the sight, some whispering prayers, others quickening their steps. None linger. It is said the land itself remembers the soil steeped in ash, the grass that grows thin and brittle, the air that carries a bitterness even in spring. The common grave lies below the kirk, marked by no names, only a mound of earth where 68 souls rest together in silence. On certain nights, villagers claim to see faint light rising from it, as if embers still glow beneath the soil. Children are told not to play near it, for voices are said to whisper from the ground, calling softly, gently, with the tones of mothers and fathers long dead. Few are brave enough to listen twice. The tale of Reverend Fletcher has become legend, told in hushed tones by firesides carried from valley to valley. Each telling adds new horrors, the sound of hymns rising in the night, the shadow of the preacher wandering the moor, the cries of children echoing from stone. Some dismiss it as folklore, a tale to frighten the young, but those who have stood near the ruin know better. They feel the weight of silence pressing on their chest, the sense of being watched from within the stones. They know the line between legend and truth is as thin as smoke. Historians have tried to tame the story, to bind it in logic. They write of fanaticism, of a man broken by the weight of his own faith. They call Fletcher an example of zeal turned to madness, of power unchecked by reason. Yet their words are dry, their explanations brittle. They cannot account for the singing still heard on winter nights, nor for the travelers who vanish when they dare the ruin after dark. Science can measure stone and soil, but it cannot measure the shadows that linger. And so the kirk endures, a place where questions outweigh answers, where silence screams louder than sermons. For the villagers, the horror was never history. It was inheritance. They carried it in their blood, in the fear passed down from parent to child. They taught their children to doubt those who claimed to speak with fire in their voice, to fear the shepherd more than the wolf. The tragedy reshaped their faith, stripping it of fire and brimstone, leaving only the fragile hope that God was gentler than his servants. Yet beneath that hope lies dread, a dread that has never been buried. On stormy nights, when lightning splits the sky and the wind howls across the moors, the ruin seems to awaken. Stones shudder, shadows stretch, and the faint glow of fire flickers in the empty windows. Some swear they hear the bell toll once more, cracked though it is, its voice rising from ash to call a congregation that will never come again. Others claim to see Fletcher himself, standing tall within the ruin, his face hidden but his presence undeniable. He does not beckon, does not speak, he only waits, as if his sermon is not yet finished. Those who witness him rarely return unchanged. Some fall into silence, their eyes hollow. Others mutter prayers without end, as though chased by flames only they can see. A few vanish altogether, swallowed by the moor, their absence becoming part of the legend, another name in the endless flock. The kirk has no doors now, no pews, no altar. Yet it remains a church of sorts, a church not of God, but of fear. Its congregation is eternal, bound not by devotion, but by memory, by terror, by the echo of screams that refuse to die. And as the years pass, the tale of the preacher who burned his own flock alive grows darker, heavier, as if fed by the very soil that holds their bones. The land will not forget. The stones will not release their voices. The fire may have burned out, but the curse endures. To stand before the ruin is to feel the weight of every soul that perished, to know that faith can save, but it can also destroy. It is to understand that horror does not fade with time. It lingers, it waits, it watches. And perhaps that is the final sermon of Reverend Fletcher. Not spoken in words, but carved in flame and stone, a lesson written in ash. Beware the shepherd who preaches only fire. Beware the faith that demands your life. Beware the silence that follows the screams. For in the valley of Scotland, on a hill scarred by ruin, the flock never left. They are still there in the smoke, in the wind, in the dark of the kirk, waiting, watching, singing.